My name is Bruce Loyd, and I'm the Agricultural Extension Agent for West Virginia University in Lewis County. And I've done a good bit of work over the years controlling weeds in trials and on-farm research trials and so on, and advising clients. And in this video today, I'm going to talk about some of the most prevalent weed problems in pastures and grasslands, hayfields in West Virginia, and some tips on how to control them. When we think about managing weeds in our pastures, the first thing we need to think about is what are weeds? And so the actual definition of a weed is a plant that's out of place. So for example, a corn plant in a soybean field would be considered a weed in that instance because it's out of place. So in our pastures, we have plants that we didn't plant. Some of them may even have weed in their name that are not actually weeds because they're beneficial to livestock. Livestock eat them, and they're really not a problem. And then there are plants that really are a problem because they take resources from our pasture, such as the sunlight and the water, and they are plants that our livestock either will not consume, or maybe they're poisonous, or maybe they're just not very beneficial, even if they will consume them. So when we think about things we can do aside from herbicides, there are management things we can do to control these weeds, these plants that we really don't want. And one of the first things you can do is just some pasture management. So things that are included with that would be things like fertility, so possibly pH of the soil. So we know that so something like broom sedge really thrives in poor soils. It may be a low pH, it may be low phosphorus levels, it may be low potassium levels, or it could be a combination of those things. But those things allow a plant like broom sedge to thrive. And there are other weeds that would also thrive in those poor soil conditions where our forage plants that we want really struggle in those conditions. So soil fertility would be one of the things you could tackle. Another thing would be just how you manage a pasture. So we're standing in a pasture here today that was pretty much continuously grazed from this point up until, from early in the spring up to this point. So it's now end of June, and this pasture, the livestock were just removed from it about a week ago. And one thing you can see right away, even though the livestock have been off of it, is there's very not much regrowth. And that is because as a continuously grazed pasture, these plants don't have very deep roots. It takes them a while after livestock are removed from a continuously grazed pasture to actually start growing and really start producing. The second thing you'll notice is there are weeds around here, and there are weeds in most pastures, but our management here has helped us produce these weeds. So if you think about it, when we put livestock in a field and just leave them in there, they have the opportunity to move around and graze what they want. They will graze what they like, what they know, and the plants that they either don't know or they don't like, they just leave them alone. And so therefore, if you think about what you're actually doing is by your management, you're helping the weeds because you're removing the weeds competition, which is the forages, right? So what we do is we graze down this grass and this clover, and we open up a canopy for these weeds to then come up. The livestock don't want to eat them because it's not something they know, not something they like, whatever it is. And then that weed just takes off and we end up with a weedy pasture. So by rotating a pasture, we give those forage plants that we're trying to grow an opportunity to compete against the weeds. And there's really good illustrations of this right here in this field, because one of the biggest and most common weed problems in pastures in West Virginia is ironweed. And so ironweed here in late June is anywhere from knee-high to taller. If you're familiar with the plant, you know by later in the summer it will be 5-6 foot tall if left alone. And right here at my feet, there are ironweed plants that are this tall, just starting to come through, and they're going to be problems. They're going to be 4 or 5 feet tall here in a few weeks because they can get sunlight, because this pasture has been opened up by this continuous grazing. So if this ironweed popped up and it was this little plant and it couldn't get light because it had a dense canopy of grass, it probably would never make it, or it would be a very weak plant and really not cause us much problem. So So this is something we need to think about in terms of our management. Of course, pasture rotations take a lot of effort in terms of we have to have water where the cattle or the sheep are, the livestock are. We have to have fence and so on. It's not as simple as having a big boundary fence and turn the livestock into it, but it makes a big difference in terms of our weed management. Okay, so we are in a site that clearly has lots of weeds, as you can see all around me here. And the reason for that is we're in a winter feeding area. So this is an area where cows were fed during the winter, round bales. It was abused really hard, and then nothing was really done after that was over. And this is what you usually get. This is what comes. And so these plants, there's a variety of plants here, which we'll talk about, some of which we'll need to try and do something about possibly, some of which we don't really need to worry about. The reason all these plants come like this is they're trying to heal the ground. So you have compaction, you have all kinds of things going on, and so some of these plants actually are trying to send down tap roots and so on to actually heal this ground. And then some of them are just opportunists. They just come in because there was open ground, there was bare soil, and so you'll have plants like that come in. And so again, some of these we won't need to worry about. There are a few that we will. And so one of these that is predominant here is this is cockleburr. And so the cockleburr, these are just getting started. And so here's one of a smaller plant. This is an annual, so it comes from the seed every year. And these, although this plant's only a foot tall, here in a few weeks it'll probably be 3 or 4 feet tall, and without any other competition or something happening to it. And so you can identify this plant not only by the leaf shape and so on, but also if you look at the stem, purple splotches up and down the stem. And as the plant gets bigger, it still has those splotches. It has them as a young plant. So you can easily identify this. And of course, later on, you'll be able to identify this because it'll have the cockleburrs on it, which are the oblong-shaped burrs that stick to your clothing, stick to sheep's wool, stick to livestock hair, and so on. And you may not be aware of this, but those hooks that allow cockleburr to stick to things was what inspired the development of Velcro. So those little hooks and catches is what inspired Velcro. So there's no burrs on these yet. We'll see these later in the season when we have the burrs. These are very difficult to control because they are an annual. If you come in and mow this right now, which a lot of people might think is the thing to do, and maybe that is a good strategy, these plants will actually come back very low and still develop seed heads very low below, say, a brush hog height. So they can be sprayed with any of the broadleaf chemicals that will control them, but then you have seed bank to contend with. These are typically, again, opportunists that come in when ground is opened up and are not as big a problem usually in a good, well-managed pasture. Another weed that we see here is a lot of is ragweed. And again, this is one I wouldn't worry too much about. It's here because the ground was opened up and there was an opportunity for it. Ragweed is pretty easy identified by these deep serrations in the leaves, and it has that raggy appearance, which is why it's called ragweed. This one's obviously not very tall, but it can get obviously several feet tall also. The reason I wouldn't worry about it too much is because usually when you get good ground cover and get things managed better, this kind of takes care of itself and usually goes away. Sometimes it needs to be sprayed with a herbicide, but not usually. Some other plants we see here are a curly dock, which there's some right here at my feet, and these are already going to seed. But the curly dock here has a kind of a leaf that inspired the name curly dock, so it has these wavy edges. This one has a seed head, and so this plant again is not one you usually have to worry too much about. Livestock may consume it some when it's young, and again, in a well-managed pasture, you have it here and there, but it's not really a big deal. And it does come in these places like this, these winter feeding areas though. Another weed we see here, which we probably again don't need to worry too much about, is this Pennsylvania smartweed, and this is it's pretty common in this field, but although it's in patches around here. It has this narrow lanceolate shaped leaf, but the big identifying characteristic here is this purple splotch. It's kind of like a streak on this particular leaf, but let me find one that has more of a splotch here that I was more typical of it. Here we go, right behind me. So here's one that has more of a purple splotch midway on the leaf, and that's fairly typical of this Pennsylvania smartweed. Again, it's not one, it comes in when there's opportunity. It's not one you really need to worry too much about. Right here is a Pennsylvania smartweed that has gone to flower. So that you see that seed head, you'll know that that's a smartweed there. You can see the splotch on that too. It's a little different than the one we just looked at. If you look around this field, you also see in various places a grass seed head poking up. And right here's one of these that I'm talking about. And this is a barnyard grass plant. And barnyard grass is a summer annual, so it comes in the summer. And again, you don't usually see it except in places where the ground has been opened up and it has an opportunity to start. It's identified by these the seed head, which has these series of spikelets, and also if you peel back a leaf, there's no ligule and no auricles on this barnyard grass, and so that's fairly uncommon among the grasses. This grass can get probably 4 foot tall or so, and can actually be fairly productive. And I've seen fields that are almost all barnyard grass, and if they're cut at the right time, it can be a productive grass. It is considered a weed, but again, if it's productive for you, then it's maybe not something you need to worry about too much. This is not something I would go out of my way to do any kind of chemical control. Just be aware of what it is and why it's there. If you look around this field, there's a fair amount of this plant here with this purplish flower, and you see it has a deep taproot. And this plant is chicory, and it's in this particular form it's considered a weed. It's not really a forage plant, although there are chicory varieties that are grown as forages. And this taproot here is an illustration of what I was talking about earlier, how this plant comes in here as a way to heal this ground and basically open up that compaction. So it's putting that taproot deep down into the soil. And so again, this is a plant that, although it's here and it's not necessarily productive for your livestock, it's probably not something you need to worry too much about, as this ground is, as the grass comes in and you keep working with it, you'll gradually push the chicory out. We do have plants in our pastures that we didn't plant and that most people may not consider forages, but that livestock will consume. They will get nutritional benefit from them, and even if you don't see livestock eating, they're not things that we really need to really worry about or be concerned about in terms of trying to control. And two of those are the plantains. There's a broadleaf plantain, which is this right here, and it's pretty easy identified by the leaf and the seed head. It's a broadleaf. You see this everywhere. It's in yards. It's in pastures. It's everywhere. It commonly is more prevalent when there is compaction and so on, and when there's some issues like that. So broadleaf plantain, and then there's a narrowleaf plantain. And the narrowleaf plantain, again, is very common everywhere, and it has easily identified by the leaf and the seed head. And so it just has a narrower leaf with veins running parallel to the leaf, and then the seed head is this spike that comes up like this, and again, very common in yards. You can mow these off and it'll shoot a new seed head. These are two weeds that really just don't worry about them. Just ignore them and let it go. And again, livestock will consume these to some degree. Another plant that you'll find in pastures that is beneficial, that cattle will and sheep, livestock will consume, is dandelion. And so don't do anything to try and control dandelion. It is helpful. It's very nutritional. Dandelion, most people recognize easily in the spring when you have the yellow flower. And then, of course, it goes into the mode where the flower expands so that the seeds blow everywhere. Most people recognize that, but you may not recognize the leaf, which is a long, narrow leaf with deep serrations. This is a small one. And then over here, there was a bigger one. So again, this is a representation of dandelion, and this is not a weed that needs controlled. The next plant we're going to cover is an invasive annual grass, and it's called Japanese stilt grass. And Japanese stilt grass was introduced from Asia many years ago into the US. It has since spread and become a big problem, not just in agriculture, but also in forestry. So as an annual grass, it germinates every year in, depending on where you are, in March or April, comes up from seed, and then if left unchecked, it grows. It can get 2 or 3, 4 feet tall, maybe, and it can form a very dense mat on the floor of the whether it's a pasture or a forest. So in forestry, the problem it causes is that it forms such a dense mat that it doesn't allow forestry trees, seedlings, to get enough sunlight to get beyond germination and actually start to grow. And so it can inhibit forestry regeneration. It likes shade, so that's why it's become a huge problem in forestry. It's also a problem in our pastures, in the areas next to tree lines, sometimes out in sunny areas, but mostly in our shaded areas. And so here's what Japanese stilt grass looks like. And it's shallow rooted, as you can see. There's not much to the roots there. If it's in your garden, for instance, you can easily just pull this, because it's easy to pull, but obviously in larger scale that's not practical. And one of the main things by the leaf you can identify is the leaf is asymmetrical, meaning the mid vein, which you can clearly see and is usually pretty bright, does not have equal parts on either side. So you can see on this leaf it's wider on this side than it is on the other side. And most grasses are symmetrical. So the mid vein runs right up the center of the leaf. So that if you find one that is asymmetrical with a leaf shape like this, it is probably Japanese stilt grass. In our pasture situations, there is a pre-emergent herbicide called Prowl H2O that can be applied pre-emergent. That means that this cannot have germinated yet, which means it has to be applied sometime in probably mid to late March to be effective, because if this has already germinated, that Prowl H2O isn't going to be effective. And so that's one thing you can do, but it's not something I really recommend for a couple reasons. Number one, it's expensive. Number two, it will control it for that year, but you have seeds in the ground, so you practically do that for several years to actually get rid of it. And what we found is that livestock will eat this. So if livestock will eat it, then don't spend the money on a herbicide. Get your livestock to eat it. Now, some people may say, no, my cows won't eat that, but we've seen evidence over and over that cattle will eat it. Sometimes they have to learn to eat it. Sometimes they have to be confined to an area that has this, maybe with a polywire, a piece of fence or something, so that they say, okay, well, there's nothing else to eat, I want to try this stuff. And once they learn to eat it, they'll almost go to it every time. And we've done forage tests on it. We know it's nutritional, has good nutritional value. So don't fight it, graze it, get your livestock to eat it, and it won't be a problem to you really anymore. It'll almost become an asset for you. Another plant that we'll see in pastures only in instances where it's been disturbed, like the winter feeding area or other reasons where the ground was opened up, is lamb's quarter, which is here. And lamb's quarter is more of a problem in crop fields, gardens, things like that. But again, we do see it. It's an opportunist. It will come in when there's opportunity, when there's open ground. And so it's a weed that it can develop quite a taproot, and it has this lighter colored on the underside. It makes it easy to identify along with the leaf shape. And again, it's not something we typically have to worry about too much, because it's something we just need to deal with the open ground, or the reason it came in to start with. So biological weed control is something that we, most of us don't give much thought, but it's something maybe we should strive for a little more. And so what I'm talking about with biological weed control is actually getting our livestock, the cattle, sheep, goats, to eat the weeds that are causing us the problem. And then they no longer become a problem, and they may even become an asset for us. And so we know that goats are generally browsers. They like to graze high in the canopy. So, and they like woody plants, thorny plants. The thorns don't bother them a bit. And so, history with goats is we know they will control some of our brushy problems like multiflora rose and so on. And they also will do a fair job on some of these herbaceous weeds that we're talking about in this video. Sheep will also control a lot of those plants, maybe to a slightly lesser degree, but things like ironweed, typically sheep will graze readily and therefore control it, where cattle usually will not. Buttercup is another one. Sheep will typically graze that and can control buttercup in a field where cattle will not. Cattle, most people think there's lots of plants cattle won't eat, and that may be true for most cattle, but you have to realize that cattle and all species learn what to eat as young from their mama. And so if the mama didn't eat a certain plant, then the calf isn't going to eat it. If the mama eats it, the calf will. So sometimes livestock, cattle, whatever it is, just need to be taught that this plant is okay to eat, and it's not going to hurt them, and it actually may taste good. And then once they learn, then the calves can learn, and then you go on. And that's kind of how it's worked with certain things like Japanese stilt grass. I've seen when it first came a problem in pastures, people said, oh, cattle won't eat it. That was the going thing, cattle won't eat it. Well, cattle will eat it. And we've seen situations where cattle actually will go to it and prefer it. And the same with some of the thorny things like thistles. You think, well, they're not going to eat that. And again, cattle will consume those. They sometimes have to learn that they are something that is good. And how do you teach them? And that can be a thing. It can be a problem. Sometimes just confining them to an area with a poly wire or some other electric fence to an area where the problem weed is for a short time may be enough. They when they're given less choice, they may poke around and start nibbling on these things and find out that they like them. Other times, people have gone to more extensive methods and trying to introduce different feeds to livestock, and then start mixing some of the feeds, the plants they wanted to eat with those feeds to try and get them to just start eating them without even realizing what they're doing. And then next thing you know, they've learned to eat that plant. So there are some ways you can try. And the home run on this situation is that if the livestock will eat it and you don't have to spend time and money to spray it, then it's a huge plus for all of us. Another thing you can do with pasture management is apply more pressure to the weeds through stocking density. Now, stocking density is different than stocking rate. Stocking rate would be the number of animals on an entire farm for a season, but density is more of a time frame thing. It's how many animals are on a particular pasture for a time period. And so you can have animals so dense that they're almost side by side in a pasture, but they're only there for a very short time, maybe a day, maybe half a day, or whatever, just depending on the situation. That stocking density is a big management tool in terms of weed control. So what it does is, if animals don't have the freedom to move around and select so much, they will now start to graze plants that otherwise they might have left, number one, or number two, because of that density, they may actually trample some of these plants. And that initial trampling may not kill them, but it makes it harder on them. And if you repeat that numerous times, then you can have an impact on your weed control. And another thing you can do is, people might say, I'm not going to manage my pasture that intensely. Okay, we get that. There may be areas of your pasture that have a intense weed problem, and by using some simple electric fence techniques, you can increase the stocking density for just that little area. In other words, put some livestock in there, put a wire around them with some water, and for a day or so, let them trample that good, eat it, whatever it is, and then move on. And maybe you don't do it for the whole farm, it's just for the areas where you have problems. So consider stocking density when you're thinking about weed management. Okay, we're at a pasture here that has lots of weeds. If you look at the whole pasture, there's a lot of ironweed, there's some thistle, there's some ragweed and so on. But this particular part of the pasture right here that I'm standing beside of has an infestation of ironweed, and it's just really thick. If you look at other areas over there, there's even some brushy stuff like some multiple rose and briars, but the other weeds are much more dispersed. But this area here, I think because it's shaded by the trees that are to my right, tends to be more moist, and so therefore this ironweed really proliferates in this part of the pasture. Ironweed is one of our biggest weed problems in pastures in West Virginia, and I'm standing here in a pasture that has a lot of ironweed in it. These are clearly out of control. They're almost as tall as I am. Some places they're taller than I am. And so ironweed can be one of those weeds where you have to make a decision. Is it something that you're going to try and control or not? So if there's a few here and there, they're scattered around, that's not really probably worth spraying unless you just want to do it for looks. as far as pasture, it's probably not worth it. But the pasture I'm standing in is clearly infested. And so when you get to this level of infestation, then the weed is taking so much of the sunlight and the moisture and the nutrients that there's very little forage production happening here, and there's just very little production here for livestock to consume. So this one here is the extreme of where you say, oh yeah, that's clearly needs control. But there's all these kind of places in between of this total infestation and the scattered, where you have to make those decisions. And it's just a matter of kind of assessing it and seeing, do you think that weed is taking a lot of the nutrients and water and sunlight from your forage plants? And that's kind of the assessment you need to make. So in this case, this needs control. And for ironweed, when they're already flowered out like this is too late. I mean, you can spray it now and you can have some effect, but the ideal time to spray this with a herbicide would be in mid-June, when they're young, a couple feet tall, and actively growing. The other thing to notice in this field is that in the areas that are somewhat open, in other words, we have some ironweed right here, but we do have a few square feet here that are no ironweed. What do we have? We have a bunch of other weeds. We have some ragweed and some smartweed and some other things scattered in here. So there's still not that much forage or grass or production, even in the areas that are somewhat open. So this field could use control, not just for the ironweed, but for some of these other things as well. This plant right here is another problem in both pastures and hay fields in West Virginia. We're in a pasture here right now, and this is horse nettle. Some people call it sandbriar. You may have other names for it. It has these thorns on the undersides of the leaves and down the stem. And it's not readily consumed by most livestock. And so when it starts in a pasture, it usually gets eaten around, as you can clearly see that has happened here. And so it's not something you're probably gonna get livestock to graze. And so in hay fields, it's usually not as a big a problem, but it can be. So in pastures, if this becomes a problem where you think it has to be controlled, something like herbicide like Graze On Next would be really good for this. Now that kind of herbicide also is going to kill all the clover that you see around here, but that may be the price you have to pay sometimes to control weed that is really starting to take over a pasture like this horse nettle. We have several thistles that cause us problems in our West Virginia pastures, and they can be divided into two different groups. There is the biennial thistles and the perennial thistles. So the biennials are, of course, a biennial is a plant that takes 2 years to complete its life cycle. And so this thistle here is a biennial, and it's a bull thistle. And so what it does in its first year is it forms a rosette, which is just a round form on the ground. It's just right on the ground. And then in the second year, it does what it's doing now, and that's called bolting. And so it basically shoots its stalk and the seed head, and then flowers and has a seed head. And so for the biennial thistles, they can be controlled at this stage right now. But usually it would be a spot spray. Unless you have a whole bunch of them, then you might do a broadcast spray. But things like Graze On Next, even Remedy would control this. Most of your broadleaf herbicides are going to probably have pretty good activity on this. It's really, though, much easier to control when it's in the rosette stage. So if you can go around your pastures in the early spring, say March, late March, early April, and just spray those rosettes, you can be controlled by virtually any broadleaf herbicide, 2,4-D, crossbow, any of those things, or anything you use on your other plant things like Graze On Next or chaparral. So the rosette is very easy to control. And then, but if it gets to this stage, this is where most people see it, then you can also control. It's going to take more herbicide, it's going to take more effort. So if you have the opportunity to scout your pastures in the early spring for those rosettes, that will help on the thistle control. Typically, livestock don't eat this thistle, but they will eat this. And I've been instances where people have, quote, trained their livestock to eat this thistle. So there's a training program you go through, which we're not going to go to in this video, but you can get livestock to eat thistle, but it's not something they're going to do on their own without some training, basically. This thistle to my left is the main perennial thistle we have trouble with in West Virginia, and this is the Canada thistle. And so this is late June right now, and these are already starting to flower out. You'll see them in all stages, down to just starting to get their flowers to already being in full flower. Here in another month, they'll mostly be in full flower. So unlike the biennial thistles, like the bull thistle, the Canada thistle is a perennial, comes from the root every year, and it is more difficult to control than the biennial thistles. And so in some pasture situations, I have seen livestock will eat this. Now you can see the livestock just left this field about a week ago, and they clearly were not having any of this. So sometimes they will, sometimes they won't. If you can get livestock to eat in a pasture, it will be a big plus because they may control it without having to use a herbicide. In a hayfield situation, this can spread through rhizomes, it can spread through seed, and you can start with a small patch and end up with a lot of this in a hayfield. So if you start seeing this in a field that's primarily a hayfield, you're probably going to want to take action to try and control this. And so when it comes to a herbicide to control Canada thistle, you'd be looking at something like Graze On Next would probably be the first choice, and maybe Chaparral. Both those have aminopyrrolid as the active ingredient. Again, Graze On Next would probably be my first choice. As far as timing, ideally you'd want to spray it when it's actively growing and before it gets to this flower stage. So these smaller plants right here that are more actively growing would be a good time. So if it's, so we're usually talking about early summer, depending on what management happened. So if you took, let's say you cut hay here in mid-June, it's June 20 something right now, you just cut hay and there was Canada thistle in that field, you cut it in the hay, and now it's growing back. So then you may be looking at about a month from now, again, actively growing plant to absorb that herbicide. A common weed problem in West Virginia in the early spring that we see it the most is buttercup. And so here's a small buttercup. This is late June, and typically you wouldn't even see a flower this time of year, but there is a flower still. And so you see the buttercup leaves here. And in the early spring, of course, if you have a buttercup problem, you see these yellow flowers everywhere. They dominate that pasture. And if you really get to looking at those pastures where buttercup is in there really serious, it can really take a lot of resources from the pasture in terms of, this is only a single plant here, but they can be so thick that you'll have areas, large areas that aren't even grazed at all at that time of year because the buttercup is just so prevalent. And so this time of year, you don't see them as much. People forget about them after the spring because the yellow flower is gone. It's down here in the canopy, and the grass starts coming around them, so people kind of forget about them. But they can cut severely into the productivity of a pasture. And so buttercup can be controlled in either late fall or early spring before the flower comes. You want to get them before the flower comes, using either Graze On Next would be an effective herbicide, or something like dicamba and 2,4-D mix, which is sold as Brushmaster. And so those herbicides, again, applied very early before the flowers appear, are very effective and can transform a pasture in terms of its early productivity. We're standing in this pasture here in late June, and if you look around this, it clearly has not had a lot of grazing pressure yet. There's a lot of dead seed heads, allowed to go mature, which is, happens. And there's weeds here. You see some ironweed down here, some bigger ironweed even. See some chicory around, some other plants. So when you have a pasture that is not continuously grazed, you will still have weeds, but you're allowing your plants to compete, and therefore the weeds that you have are generally not as healthy, not as thrifty. So as we graze this, as this gets some grazing pressure here through the next month or so, and you start to remove some of this grass, some of these, there's small ironweed down in this canopy that's only 6 inches tall that will be, it's kind of like opening up a canopy of a forest. It opens that up for sunlight, and then it can really start exploding. So just another point on how grazing management plays a big role in the weed pressure you have. And if you look at the ironweed in here and some of the other weeds that are in this pasture, to me, it's not something that requires control. You have some weeds, they are taking some sunlight, they're taking some moisture, so they're using some of your resources, but you got to balance that against the cost, the time, the effort and so on of actually doing a herbicide control to control some of these ironweed. When we think about the different ways to control weeds, one way that is frequently used is mechanical control. So what I mean by that, of course, is mowing or brush hogging. And so there's places around the state, different farms that is their weed control. They brush hog their farm every year, and usually it's in the fall of the year, maybe August, September, usually September, October. And so the question is, how useful is that for weed control? Well, the answer to that is if it actually controlled the weeds, you wouldn't have to do it every year, right? So these weeds, this ironweed here, this thistle that's coming, when you mow that, what you do is you control the size of it. And so from that aspect, it is successful because it does keep it from getting much size. And if you brush hog multiple rows or other brush plants, size control is a benefit. But these ironweed and so on will not be controlled by mowing. They will control the size. It will make it look better, give you the aesthetic look, but it will not kill the plant. And so, particularly in the fall of the year, in the September, October frame, when most people will do their mowing or brush hogging, those plants have already taken their reserves, as they're perennial, their reserves down to the roots, and it's basically a dead plant anyway. And so mowing that has no value except aesthetics. So that's something to consider if you're actually trying to keep the plant from growing, then and you're having to mow it every year, then it may be time to consider a herbicide application in combination. So maybe you do a herbicide one time and then react to that in terms of whether you need to do more mowing or not. Mowing in and of itself usually does not control these weeds. It just controls the size. It does have also a place when we talk about pasture management in terms of knocking seed heads off of mature grasses and getting them to go back into a vegetative state. But for weed control, it has limited value. This plant behind me and around me is one of the most common weed problems in our West Virginia hay fields, and that is hemp dogbane. And so what happens with hemp dogbane is it's usually present in first cutting as maybe a small plant, although it may not be noticeable. But when that first cutting is taken in late May, June, or even July, then again this plant is kind of released, and it's allowed to explode and really grow. And so hemp dogbane really likes that culture of that first cutting and then nothing else happening, and it can really thrive in those settings. Fertility doesn't seem to matter in terms of poor or bad. In other words, if you improve fertility, it isn't going to get rid of the plant. And so it's probably going to have a herbicide application to get rid of it. And so hemp dogbane is sometimes confused with milkweed. Milkweed acts a lot the same way. You don't really see it so much usually in first cutting, but then after that first cutting is removed, then it will kind of explode and take off. And so if you look at the two plants, this is a milkweed in my left hand here, and here's a hemp dogbane I've just plucked in my right hand. And so one thing you notice right off is that the milkweed has typically larger leaves. Okay, so milkweed in my left hand has a larger leaf than hemp dogbane in general, leaf size comparison. And the veins on milkweed from the mid vein running out are almost perpendicular to the mid vein. So you see them running out. On hemp dogbane, you got the mid vein and the veins running out are more at an angle. The other thing you'll notice almost always is that the hemp dogbane has this reddish stem, whereas milkweed, the stem is green. And then clearly when they get into the flowering stage, then you'll notice a big difference, because the milkweed has that kind of a pod-like thing, whereas the hemp dogbane, the seed is like a bean. And this is not in seed yet. We just have flowers here today, so there's no seeds here with the beans. But you'll see these long beans. They'll get to be probably 6 inches long, just hanging from the hemp dogbane plants. So in an infestation level, as this particular part of the field, the whole field's not like this, but just this little bit right here, is pretty well infested, and you can see that it is this weed is using a lot of the resources that are available here in terms of sunlight and moisture, and it's really cutting down on the forage production. Of course, when you cut this field for hay and this is all mowed for hay and it's baled up, it's not going to be as nutritional or as good a value as if there were grasses and clovers here. So when it gets to this kind of level, and if your whole field was like this, or even in this section of the field, this is the time that it's worth control, because it's really affecting the productivity of this field significantly. Now, you don't see hemp dogbane or milkweed for that matter routinely, at least at infestation levels, in pastures. And why is that? And that's primarily because cattle, livestock will eat these. And so even though they're actually considered poisonous plants, they'll eat these, and the levels of toxicity is low enough that it really doesn't affect them, and they will control these in pastures. And so you rarely ever have a problem with hemp dogbane or milkweed in pastures. The other control, other than just a broadcast spray that you can do on hemp dogbane that is very effective, is to use a wick applicator or a weed wiper. And in this case, since it's a broadleaf weed, you don't have to use glyphosate. You can use something like a pasture guard is really good. And the 5% herbicide mix in the weed wiper. And the reason pasture guard is so nice compared to glyphosate is that you can set the weed wiper really low, and if you hit the grass or other clovers or whatever else is in here, then you don't risk killing those plants, because pasture guard is selective toward broadleaves, and it's not going to affect the grass. Now, it will kill clover if you get clover. But if you look at this hemp dogbane, you see there's some real tall growing plants like this, but down in the canopy, there's also some shorter plants that are down here, down about almost the height of the grass. And so if you wipe up high here, you're going to miss those that are down there. So by wiping lower, you can get more of the hemp dogbane. It takes less herbicide to do that than if you do a broadcast spray with pasture guard, which would be the herbicide you would use to control this if you're going to do a broadcast spray. But it's also more difficult. It's more time consuming, because your weed wipers are usually only 8 or 10 feet wide, so it's a lot of trips back and forth to wipe this herbicide on this weed. The weed around me here, you see all around, is milkweed, and it's a very common weed problem in our West Virginia hay fields. It's not as big a problem typically as hemp dogbane, but it is still it can be a significant problem if it gets an infestation level where it really covers the ground. And this particular knoll that I'm standing on, it's not really an infestation. There is a lot of it here, but you see lots of grass and clover growing among it still. However, by the time this is cut for hay, which may be several weeks from now still, the milkweed will be much taller, and it will make up a significant volume of the hay from this particular area. The problem you get into when trying to decide about milkweed control is it is the primary host plant for monarch butterflies, and that's a insect we want to promote. And so when you remove milkweed, you're removing a host plant for for those butterflies. So that's a negative, and it's something to consider maybe when you are deciding whether to control this or not. In this particular case, I probably would not worry about controlling this in this little area right here, but also know that over time, this is going to spread more. They usually don't go away on their own, and so it's going to spread more and cover a larger area. If you deem that you need to control the milkweed, then pasture guard is probably the best herbicide that it does not require a pesticide applicator's license to do a broadcast spray with. You could also use a weed wiper on it, and pasture guard happens to also be the best control for hemp dogbane, which a lot of times you find hemp dogbane and milkweed in a field together, and so that same herbicide would be the best control for both of them. Johnson grass, which you see behind me here, is a huge crop problem across the United States, and it's a problem in crops in West Virginia as well, but it's also a problem in our grasslands. And so you might think, well, it's a grass, and so we're trying to grow grass, what's the problem? And the issue is that Johnson grass is a warm season perennial, and most of our pastures and hay fields are cool season grasses. And so what happens is in hay fields usually, this is a primary problem in hay fields, when the first cutting is cut, it's not either not noticed or it's not even there because in the cool part of the spring, Johnson grass hasn't really started growing yet. The hay's cut, and then just like in the field we see here, it's basically released. If it's there, it has now sunlight, it has an opening, and it's the time of year for warm season grass to really explode. And so in that June time frame basically, and so it just starts growing, and as a warm season grass, it loves the heat, and it will grow so much faster than the cool season grasses that are native or that we have in our fields. And so you can see here, it's about 3-4 foot tall. And our cool season grasses that are the aftermath of our second cutting are down here at about 8 inches or maybe a foot. And so it's extremely difficult to manage both, because this Johnson grass, as it continues to grow and get taller, and it will get taller, it'll get 6-8 feet, it gets very, very coarse, very stemmy. So if you let it go, then it makes very poor hay because it is so stemmy. And if you cut it now, then your cool season grasses are so short that your yield is really low. And so that's why it's difficult to manage both. Johnson grass by itself can be a good productive crop, but that's not what we're dealing with. We're dealing with it mixed in with our cool season grasses, which makes it hard to deal with. And so in pastures, you don't hardly ever see it because livestock will readily graze it, and they'll control it and probably actually kill it out. It's a perennial, and it is difficult to control, and it spreads readily because it spreads from the seed heads and also spreads from rhizomes, these underground stems basically that go and shoot up new plants. And so the other thing that makes Johnson grass extremely difficult is, as a grass, the broadleaf herbicides that we're controlling all these other weeds with will not control Johnson grass because it's not a broadleaf, it's a grass. And so anything you would spray to kill Johnson grass is going to kill the cool season grasses as well. And so obviously that's a problem. See how stemmy that is already, even at this young age? And as this thing gets bigger, it gets stemmier and coarser. And also you can see the root system on this bad boy. There are no herbicides currently labeled in West Virginia to kill Johnson grass and not the other grasses. There is a herbicide that will do that, but it's not labeled for use in our pastures and hay fields. So that leaves us with some really difficult choices. And like in this particular case behind me here, here's a whole section that is just nothing but Johnson grass. And if you look down in there, there's some other cool seasons down in there, but the amount of them is so small, it's just minuscule. And this patch here, it's almost a no-brainer that you need to spray this whole area. But what you'll find is you'll have little patches spread around the field that are then, it doesn't justify spraying a whole field. And so the control for this is going to be something like glyphosate, which is a non-selective herbicide. And so if you go to kill a little patch, you're also going to kill everything that's around that little patch. In this case right here, it might be worthwhile to do a broadcast spray on just this corner here of this field and kill all this Johnson grass with a glyphosate and kill everything else that's here too. And then possibly reseed this one area, because this has infested this corner so bad, and it's going to spread through the field. And if look around the field, you see there's little patches of it in other places already, so it's going to spread. You know, this plant's only 3 feet tall, and it's already real fibrous inside there. The other option, other than a broadcast spray, again using glyphosate, glyphosate herbicide, is to wipe this Johnson grass with a weed wiper. And so that's a situation where you take there's different types of weed wipers. Some are just like a pipe with a canvas-like material around it, and holes in the pipe, and that lets the herbicide soak into the canvas, and you basically drive across the field with that pipe mounted on a tractor bucket or some sort of a mounting apparatus, and just wipe the herbicide on the leaves of the Johnson grass. It's taller than the other stuff, the other plants in the field, so you don't risk injuring the other plants that you want to keep. So it makes it an ideal choice as something to use a weed wiper on. In fact, some of the first uses of weed wipers were on Johnson grass in soybeans, where it was growing taller than the soybeans. So another type of weed wiper is a rotary weed wiper, where the herbicide is sprayed on the outside of the drum, and it has a mechanism that as you drive across the field, that drum rotates. And again, it's just the same kind of idea, that you're trying to wipe that herbicide onto the leaves. So you use a lot less herbicide for one thing, but you also don't get the herbicide on the plants you want to keep, like the lower growing clover and cool season grasses. In the case of this plot behind me here, this is so thick and just like it was planted, that I would not use a weed wiper here. But in other areas of the field where you just have patches, that might be places where you could use a weed wiper. Or some people have even gone to these patches and done it manually using some sort of I'll imagine like a hockey stick with a wiper on the end that has herbicide on that cloth on the end of that, and you just kind of wipe the patches. Of course, that depends on the scale of your problem. If it may be bigger than that, and so that kind of a application may be not really feasible. So that's your options for Johnson grass control. It is one that if you start to see it in your fields, you probably want to take action sooner rather than later, because it is not going to go away on its own, and it's going to continue to spread. Oftentimes when we have a weed problem in a pasture or hayfield, we have the decision to make of whether it's something that's bad enough to justify some sort of a herbicide application, because we have the cost and time involved with that. And so we're in a field here right now that was cut for hay. This is right now we're in early August, and this was cut for hay several weeks ago. And then this cocklebur, which you see clear up this draw, came back really hard, and it wasn't really much there before, but whenever the hay was taken off, then that opened that canopy up for those seedlings to really take off. And so because of the density that and the reduction of forage because of that weed, both in sunlight, moisture it's taken, nutrients, all that, it was deemed that this was a good candidate to do a herbicide application. So this was sprayed 4 days ago with Grazon Next, and it has the added benefit of getting some other weeds that you probably wouldn't have sprayed for, like this ironweed right here, and other parts of the field you can't see right now have a lot more ironweed. So the main reason for spraying this field was for this cocklebur, which was going to be a huge problem, not only for production of forage, but also going to be spreading a lot to seed as animals come in here and get burrs on them and so on. So that was the main reason for spraying it. Also getting this ironweed, there's a lot of Queen Anne's lace or wild carrot in here too that also is going to be killed by this, and some other weeds that are present in smaller numbers that you never would have sprayed the field for just for those alone. So this is the kind of thing you get into, is deciding when to spray or not to spray. And when you have an infestation like this, it's probably time to take action. I hope this video has been useful for you and helpful as you look at trying to control weeds or advising others to control weeds. As always, if you have difficulty understanding the label or need help trying to figure out what to do, consult your county extension agent or your local conservation districts for help.
This virtual pasture walk is brought to you by the West Virginia Conservation Agency, funded through the NRCS Grazing Lands Conservation Initiative. For similar content, please visit grazingprofessionals.us.